If you're watching this video, you're probably interested in learning a language. And when you try to find information on how to do so, you get hundreds of different recommendations. Some people saying you should learn by speaking a lot. Some say don't speak at all and focus on listening instead. Some recommend language learning apps, and others say they're just a waste of time. This would naturally lead anyone to confusion, trying a bunch of different things with no real plan in mind, until they inevitably give up, thinking they could never learn successfully. But what if I told you this doesn't actually have to be you? Because learning a language is actually not that difficult, and you could learn one to conversational fluency in just 3 to 12 months. I made tons of mistakes starting out learning languages, but thanks to the method I'm going to show you in this video, I feel comfortable knowing the right things to do at each step of the way now. So if you want to hear about my fun, fast, and effective language learning method that, unlike your high school Spanish, will actually get you fluent, then stick around. Now I've separated this method into 3 different stages: the building stage, expanding stage, and perfecting stage. Each one is designed to build off of the previous one to ultimately get to the point of conversational fluency in the span of 3 to 12 months. Now my personal definition of conversational fluency is not being able to speak about and understand everything, but also not just being able to say hello in the language. Rather, it's more so a middle ground that allows you to travel to the country and speak about everyday topics. So if a native speaker came up to you and tried to talk, you'd probably stumble over your words a little bit, but nonetheless be able to hold a conversation so long as it doesn't go into the realms of astrophysics or rocket science. But if you do want to get to the point of being able to do that later down the line, then this method can be extended as well, something I talk more about in stage 3. So with that being said, let's start off by getting into stage 1. The first stage is going to be the building stage, and this will last anywhere from 1 to 4 months. Closer to 1 if you're, for example, an Italian trying to learn Spanish, and more like 4 months if you're, for example, an American trying to learn Japanese. Now, because giving up is the #1 reason people fail to learn languages, stage 1 is all about building fun habits that will keep you learning consistently. A big mistake you want to avoid in stage 1 is going too hard in the beginning. Even if you have a lot of motivation when starting out learning a language, it might not be the best idea to try and spend every waking moment of your day learning that language. Because having to sustain these overly ambitious habits will inevitably get draining when you do lose some of that motivation. And then you'll just be setting yourself up for failure, making yourself feel bad unnecessarily. Therefore, it's important to remember that your goal in the beginning shouldn't be to spend as many hours as you can learning, but rather to build consistency and then slowly ramp up the amount of time you're spending with time. So my advice here is finding activities you enjoy that are at least partially in your target language. So for example, an app you enjoy that you can use for a while every single day, or a TV show that you like to watch, even if you start out watching it with English subtitles. The most important thing here is consistency. This is all about building the habit of learning and reminding yourself that you're trying to become a speaker of this new language. So even doing seemingly silly stuff like consuming the cuisine of the country you're trying to learn the language of, or listening to some music of that language, can actually help you to boost your motivation and sort of put yourself in the right state of mind for learning. But this is not to say that stage 1 doesn't involve any studying. I'm not going to let you off the hook that easily. So you're still going to have to study. And the first kind you're going to do is vocabulary study. Specifically, the 1000 most common words in that language. This is because the 1000 most common words make up over 80% of the speech you hear. So if you can get those down early, then you're going to get a massive head start in the language. My personal favorite way of doing this is using an SRS, or spaced repetition software as they're called. And this is really just a fancy name of an app that reminds you of things you've learned before you forget them again. My personal favorite here is Anki, but there are other apps as well, so just find one that you like and stick to it. Now the good thing here is that if you're learning a pretty popular language like Japanese, Spanish, etc., then there are probably already pre-made decks for you that are done with the most common words in the language that you can just download and get started with. But if that's not the case for your language, then create your own deck, and do that by looking up a word frequency list for the most common words in that language, then making flashcards of around 5 to 15 ones every single day, depending on the intensity of your study. Now, along with learning the most common words of the language, this is also the time to start learning some basic grammar. I'm personally not someone who likes to focus a lot on complex grammar, as I think that's something we pick up pretty easily from just consuming the language, but I do think learning some basic grammar is very important, as it can speed up your learning process a whole lot. So learning things like basic verb conjugations and the sentence structure of the language is something you really want to focus on during stage 1. And whether you want to do this through a textbook, app, or online grammar guide, it's really up to you. I personally use an app called Language Transfer for Spanish grammar and the Genki textbook for Japanese grammar. But honestly, I think my results would have been pretty similar no matter the method I used. Now in terms of priority during stage 1, I'd say your primary focus should be grammar, secondary should be vocabulary, and tertiary should be consuming content. So spend most of your time building an understanding of how the grammar works, but also a good chunk of time learning common words, and then use leftover time for stuff you enjoy, like an app or a TV show or even listening to some music. After doing these activities for around 1 to 4 months, you should now have a basic grasp of the language and be able to create simple sentences. But it's very important that you don't get stuck here and actually move on to stage 2, which is the most important stage. Now stage 2 is all about expanding on the base you built during stage 1. So after learning the basics of the language, you want to find ways to put your newly learned knowledge to use and actually solidify what you've learned. The first step of doing this is by lowering the amount of time you spend on grammar and increasing the amount of time you spend consuming content, as well as switching native language subtitles to target language subtitles. Because you now know the basics of the language you're trying to learn, you should be able to regularly identify words and sentences in the content you consume. Now, you won't understand all of it, but that's okay. Just focus on what you can understand and go from there, because with time, your brain will learn things subconsciously, but only if you let it do that. The main way I'd recommend learning vocabulary or grammar at this stage is by taking advantage of the content you're consuming, and writing down words or grammar points you hear repeatedly but don't know the meaning of to make flashcards out of and put in your SRS. Because you've already learned the most common words and grammar rules, you can now focus on things that you encounter in your day-to-day life watching content in the language, which is going to be a lot more effective than just learning random words from here on out. Now exactly what kind of content you want to watch is up to you, but if you're learning a fairly popular language, there's usually going to be a lot of content available if you want something easier that's specifically made for beginners in that language. This is personally the approach I took to both Spanish and Japanese, and I'd highly recommend it to anyone learning a language, as it allows you to naturally progress from easier content to more advanced content and then ultimately taking the step to native content whenever you're ready. So, if you look up your language, then comprehensible input on YouTube, you should be able to find a lot of content, hopefully in your language, that's from beginner to advanced. But if those aren't available for you in your language, or they're just a little bit too boring for you, which they definitely can be at times, then simply watching regular TV shows or YouTube videos can work well too. Even reading, consuming audiobooks or podcasts can work, so long as you're actually consuming the language when you have some time over. Remember, the most important thing here is not to understand everything that's being said, but rather to understand what you can and not getting caught up on what you can't understand. Your brain is pretty smart and will naturally figure the language out if you give it the time to do so, because this is the way we all learned our native languages, something I speak more about in the card above. So in short, stage 2 should mostly be about consuming content you enjoy in the language without English subtitles, and then writing things down that you can understand and putting them into your flashcard app of choice and learning them from there. As for grammar study, it's more or less optional at this stage, so if you really hate it, then you don't have to do it, but I do still think it offers a marginal benefit, so I would still do it at this stage if I were you. You're now at the end of stage 2, and have learned the basics of vocab and grammar, as well as spent a lot of time consuming the language. So now it's time to start perfecting and refining this big rock of language learning skills that you've created into something more functional. And that brings us to stage 3. If you follow the steps so far, it's now been around 2 to 8 months, and you've built a solid study routine using resources that you enjoy. You've also avoided some of the most common language learning mistakes, and you're getting real close to your ultimate goal of conversational fluency. But there's one stage left, and that's the perfecting stage. This stage can look pretty different depending on what your goal is. Some people might be happy just stopping at conversational fluency, while others want to actually build a whole new life in the language and get completely fluent. So, depending on how high of a level you want to reach, you might actually want to extend stage 2 for a little bit. But if you're happy just stopping at conversational fluency, then I think starting stage 3 at around the 2 to 8 month mark depending on your language is a pretty good idea. This whole process has been preparing you with the knowledge you need about the topics you're interested in to be able to seamlessly transition from inputting in the language to outputting. But the plan is also designed to be able to be extended almost indefinitely, until you feel like your comprehension is at a satisfactory level for going on to stage 3. So this stage is really for whenever you got into that spot. And it's now that you want to start working on your weak points, learning specific vocabulary and slang, as well as most importantly, starting to have conversations in the language. So whether you decide to start speaking to natives in real life, using apps like HelloTalk and Tandem, or getting an online tutoring service like italki, the most important thing here is that you actually start speaking, because speaking is a whole separate skill that needs to be trained for you to get good at it. But like I said, stage 3 is also the time for starting to work on your weak points and special interests. Because you've already got the basics down, this is when you can start focusing more on specific pronunciation habits, or slang, or things that you just in general want to use the language for. Maybe you have a special hobby that you want to do in the language, then start learning some specific vocabulary for that hobby. But no matter what your goals and interests look like, just make sure you keep doing the things you were doing in stage 2, as they're going to be the cornerstones of an effective language learning routine. And other than that, this is it. You've now reached conversational fluency. Congrats. I hope this video was helpful to you, as I know it would have been for me when I started out learning languages. So if you enjoyed it, then why not give me a subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.